Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for tonight's event with Matthew Specktor in conversation with Jonathan Lethem and Dana Spiotta discussing Always Crashing in the Same Car. Tonight's event will end with a Q&A, and to submit a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. If you see a question on the list that you'd like for our speakers to answer, please click the like button. It'll bump it up in the queue, and we'll try to answer as many questions as time will allow. Please also feel free to engage with each other and the conversation and reading in the chat area, as you already are. I'm loving seeing a lively audience, so thank you all for being so chatty with us. And we'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future, and you can learn more about them on our website by signing up for our email newsletter. You can follow us on social media at BookSoup, and you can also follow our Crowdcast page right here and subscribe to our YouTube channel for past events. And our next event is tomorrow, with actress Mina Suvari and entrepreneur Zibby Owens discussing Mina's new memoir, The Great Peace. Please support independent bookstores and Book Soup and our authors tonight by purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book, which you can do by clicking the green button, purchase button right below the viewer screen. It'll redirect you to our website where you can complete the checkout process, and it won't interrupt viewing, so you can do that at any time. And we're also selling digital audiobooks and ebooks through Libro FM and Kobo for those interested. I did put a Libro FM link at the top of the chat, but I'll send that again so you don't have to scroll all the way back. And we're also open for in-store browsing, so if you're local to Los Angeles, please come say hi with a mask, 10 a.m. to 7 p.m., and we would love to see you. And with that said, let me introduce our guests for this evening. Matthew Specktor is the author of the novels American Dream Machine and That Summertime Sound, a nonfiction book, The Sting, and the forthcoming memoir, The Golden Hour, with Echo and HarperCollins. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Paris Review, The Believer, Tin House, Vogue, GQ, Black Clock, and Open City. He has been a McDowell Fellow and is a founding editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books, and he resides in Los Angeles. Welcome, Matthew.
Hi.
Jonathan Lethem is the best-selling author of 11 novels, including The Feral Detective, The Fortress of Solitude, and Motherless Brooklyn, winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award. He currently teaches creative writing at Pomona College in California. Welcome, Jonathan. And last but not least, Dana Spiotta is the author of 5 novels, most recently Wayward. Spiotta lives in Syracuse and teaches in the Syracuse University MFA program. Thank you all for being with us tonight. We're so excited to have you. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to our guests. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation.
Hi, guys.
Hey there.
So nice to see you.
Yeah,
too.
so nice to be part of your launch.
And so nice to see the names of so many people that are dear to me, old friends and people that Dana, you and I remember from high school, and writers that I love. Eden Lepucki, hello. Laura Worrell, whose novel I'm very excited about. It's just it's a good crowd. So should we kick this off by maybe having me read just a little?
I think that would be great. Why don't you read first? Yeah. I'm
just going to read a couple pages from the beginning of the book, the very not the beginning, but the near beginning, the sort of noirish setup, I suppose. Some time ago, in my younger and more vulnerable years, I suffered a kind of crash. Suffered may be a grand and heroic word for it, considering the quantities of more profound misery in the world, but nevertheless, I found myself loose, at large within the city where I'd grown up, from which I'd departed in a nervous panic at 18, and to which I'd only recently returned. Hollywood. Los Angeles contains so many subquadrants, most of them having nothing in particular to do with the movies, but Hollywood, which is as much a notion as it is a neighborhood, one that permeates the actual city like a gas, is where I'm from. My childhood home may have sat in Santa Monica, a sleepy suburb by the sea, but my family resided in Hollywood as surely as anyone ever has. Which place is to many folks still a metonym, a symbol of all that is shiny and empty and attractive and awful in American life, all that is stupid and all that is, we can't help it, irresistible to us, pulling as it does with the hopeful energy of sex. To me, growing up, this city had been the precise opposite, a glamourless desert, a hall of mirrors where I was unable to escape my own unfortunate reflection. All those roads and avenues running nowhere beneath the green palms, leading me back inexorably to my own perceived limitations. Surely there was something the matter with me. How could I dislike my own hometown so much? I'd ejected myself with all the force of a hairball, fled east to college in Massachusetts, west to San Francisco, then east again to New York City. I'd been elsewhere for a long, long time, and now that I was home, probing along the margins of my native place the way you would at an abscessed tooth, with tenderness and care and a gnawing fascination, I fell in love, though to this day I cannot quite say with what. Maybe it was just the thing about Los Angeles that claims everybody eventually. Weather, buildings, loveliness, light. Or maybe I'd fooled myself again. Having expatriated myself from the city for so long and having insulated myself for a while by marriage, one that had recently ended, I was coming to it now as an outsider, and for the same reason so many do, as a sucker, hoping against some very steep odds for success. I'll take it. My voice echoed sharply off the walls of a small but empty room, the acoustics of which, wood floors, high ceiling, made it feel slightly larger, just big enough that I might not feel for a while the potential for confinement. Okay, great. The landlady, a gnomish, leathery-looking figure with the straw blonde hair of someone 30 years her junior, smiled. I'll draw up a lease. She leaned over conspiratorial and whispered, "You know who used to live here? Cary Grant." Really? You know who else? Al Pacino. I stared at her. There was no way of knowing if either of these things was true, if she was serving up local folklore, or if, as she pulled a cell phone from her pocket and showed me a number she insisted was Pacino's, this landlady was in fact a little bit nuts. But in a way, it didn't matter. Los Angeles is full of such apocrypha. This apartment was just a ghost crib, a launching pad towards a greater, more hopeful future. Cool, I said as I followed her outside. I'll try to honor them both. The place I had landed was at the stone center of Hollywood's mythological grid, the head of the Sunset Strip, the intersection at Crescent Heights that shears off into Laurel Canyon on one side and toward Beverly Hills and the beach if you gaze straight ahead, at the twisting road that winds past the Chateau Marmont and a million other landmarks, the Whiskey A Go-Go, the Roxy, the Polo Lounge, and the Beverly Hills Hotel. Hollywood. If you picture it, apart from its fabled hillside sign, this is what you see. If you're attuned to this place, its history and poetics, you think of all the things that have happened along this very street, or in the canyons that branch directly away from it. John Belushi ODing on a speedball in one of the rooms at the Chateau. Jim Morrison kicked out of the Whiskey Forever for unspooling the Oedipal psychodrama of the end and obscenity too far. Arthur Lee of the great 60s band Love, himself stoned immaculate between Clark and Hilldale, his band collapsing in a fog of drugs and money problems. The Manson murders. Farther west, the OJ murder. If you wanted to, you could map the entirety of Sunset Boulevard, all 21 3/4 miles of it, exclusively in terms of mayhem and collapse. Chart it as purely as the Stations of the Cross. For a place so synonymous with hedonism, this city sure seems to arrive at one bummer after the next. And for a place so gilded, so enamored, again, still with stardom, it sure does seem to cradle more than its fair share of failure, of oblivions both natural and man-made. Perhaps I was simply obsessed. We've all seen the movies, Norma Desmond beckoning for her close-up in Billy Wilder's indelible portrait of a faded silent screen star, Sunset Boulevard, Jake Gittes and Philip Marlowe, the great PIs of respectively Chinatown and The Long Goodbye, both endlessly chastened and infinitely bruised, shivved up and knocked out for the simple sin of curiosity. Los Angeles might be a place for those who ask no questions to thrive. In this, it is like every other place. But for those who wonder, who voice even the most basic existential concerns, what the fuck am I doing here and why? This city is a sticky wicket. What was I doing here? I'd left, I came to realize, for reasons having everything to do with failure. My mother's as an unhappy screenwriter and an abusive alcoholic whose career collapsed under the weight of her own disappointment and rage. My own as a son trying to please a hypercritical talent agent father, one of the early architects of creative artists agency whose tall shadow fell across the film industry. LA's maybe, in its inability to live up to what I once thought a city should be, and with my own hopeless desire to transcend it. I'd wanted to be a writer. Leaving aside that this was a dubious, romantic, at once trivial and ridiculous ambition, at least the way I wanted it then, it seemed somehow out of true with what this city was about. Bret Easton Ellis, who grew up 3 years ahead and 5 miles away, told me once, I associated literature with the East. My goal was to find a college, get through 4 years, then make the move to New York. Same here. LA was for idiots and movie producers, people who didn't even read. And if my interest in literature, as I understood that term at 17, marked me out also as a pretentious jerk, I nevertheless knew what I didn't want to be: a hack, a sellout, a screenwriter. Flash forward 20 years. I've settled in now to this apartment in West Hollywood on Hayworth Avenue, next door to the Directors Guild of America, 30 years maybe from the Strip. It's beautiful, this place. Small, but beautiful. A Spanish-style building with a courtyard and pink tiles, terracotta mosaic outside and hardwood floors within, French windows on either side, so when I open the place up at midday, my apartment is a sieve for light and wind and even, no joke, the occasional hummingbird who trembles on the verge and then flits in and flits out. There's a fireplace, but who needs it? The apartment is a studio, just one rectangular upstairs room with an L consisting of kitchen and bath, but it'll do for now. By day, it's the live workspace of my dreams. By night, a different story. The windows fold shut, the Murphy bed comes out of the wall, and the room becomes a prison, my riot cell, the roof beneath which my preschool-age daughter is not sleeping. A few miles away, she rests inside the home I have vacated to my wife, a banker. She can afford the mortgage, as I suddenly cannot, and her boyfriend/coworker, of whom I try not to think too much. I pace, I swelter, I harbor my grudges. I labor a little fruitlessly on a novel, and I contemplate the looming Writers Guild of America strike that has slowed hiring around town. Mid-level screenwriters such as myself barely stands a chance, but which also absolves me of having to contemplate the crappiness of the last thing I've written, a script so lousy I wish I could bury it in a vault at the bottom of the sea. I drink, I surf Craigslist, and in those days before Tinder or Bumble, flirt and have occasional sex with strangers. I wake up in the middle of the night to pee and wade into the bathroom clutching a broom with both hands, preparing to smash the enormous palmetto bugs that will scurry the moment I hit the light. I flail blindly. More than once, I hit the mirror above the sink, which cracks and then eventually shatters, so I have to replace it on the cheap. I'll stop there. That Moorish beginning. Hard-boiled.
Hard-boiled, yeah. Well, so I mean, it raises so many questions. Anyway, I'm going to play the moderator a little bit here because I'm the one who didn't go to the same high school as you two, and also you both have books out. Congratulations! This is the Matthew's launch, and but it's so near to the debut of Wayward for Dana. A really wonderful novel. There ought to be a button for your book on the screen too. Yeah. So I'm going to play the moderator and say. At the very outset, I'm going to say there is an ask the question button and anyone can hit it. And Dana and I will see those and feed some of them into the talk. I have a feeling there's every chance there'll be more than we can possibly paraphrase and ask Matthew, but give it a shot. And if you ask a question in the chat on the side, we'll probably spot that too. And I think it'll get fit in. In the meantime, yeah. So what you read is amazingly hard-boiled and classical in its hard-boiled style, and it raises a couple of questions that I think are maybe cool places to start. Which is, why does this feel so much like a novel? And how do you identify this book in its relation to the hard-boiled style and genre? I mean, there's aspects of memoir, there's aspects of cultural study, and how did you arrive at this confabulation? What was the point of origin?
I think the point of origin was I had written a novel after American Dream Machine. I think after American Dream Machine, which was 8 years ago, much to my amazement. I had spent some time writing a couple different pilots for different cable networks that didn't go anywhere. I'd written a novel that took me a little while to complete, and I got to the end of it, and I just couldn't get comfortable with it, and I felt like it just didn't feel quite what I wanted it to be, and I kind of got caught up in realizing how many of the books that I was responding to in those years were not novels, or were books that were sort of hard to categorize. Right. I mean, it was, I just remember kind of looking at the books that I was kind of babbling about to people, and I thought, well, Heidi Julevitz's The Folded Clock, which is a sort of wonderful, strange book, or Sarah Mangusa's 300 Arguments, or Hilton Al's The Women was a book that I remember being kind of flabbergasted that he'd written this book that was a sort of, a piece of criticism, but that had this kind of submerged personal aspect to it. Right. I mean, that he kind of like, there's a moment in it where he kind of alludes in an almost comic way to a suicide attempt that he'd made, during the period that he was describing. And I thought, holy shit, that struck me as that kind of hybridity struck me as appealing, and kind of natural. It also made me feel like on some level, even though the kind of personal narrative aspects of this book, or every aspect of this book is as grounded in fact as I could make it. Like I'm not inventing, I'm not James Frying it or whatever, but to me, I still think of it as a novel. Like I think of it as, a novel. We sometimes have a kind of, reductive idea of what a novel can be. And so I thought, well, this is a way of approaching the form in a way that felt fresh to me. The sort of classical nature of the setup didn't really occur to me, not only until after I finished the book, but until I was reading the audiobook recently. I thought, man, this sounds a little hard boiled. And it did make me kind of realize that, a noir is, noir, that the sort of general noir tropes involve, urban corruption, right? The sort of the romantic or the hopeful or the disillusioned PI unwinding some sort of civic corruption. And I realized, in this book, the corruption is my corruption. The corruption is, the corruption of my person, but by exposure to the movie business. And so that there's a way in which, that's the thing that's being unwound. That's the cadaver that's being solved by the various stories and people whose work I'm interrogating. And I definitely didn't want to write a kind of memoir of middle-aged complaint. I don't think anybody needs that from a male perspective at this point. So the form came very sort of natural, stemmed very naturally from there.
Dynamite.
So Matthew, one of the things that really strikes me in the book, because you alternate between this memoir stuff that we just read from and talking specifically about writers and musicians and actors. And what it reminds me of is, since I've known you, you've always been the most enthusiastic, the most generous and eccentric enthusiast of the things that you love. Like, you see the world. And I want to talk a little bit about how your enthusiasms for books, for movies that you love, how that affects you as a writer, how that shapes you as a writer, because it seems like it really kind of creates your creative energy. It kind of like feeds your creative energy to love the books you love and love the actors you love. And however, and the more obscure they are, maybe the better, but not always, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think, this is, I think, a trait that we all, to some extent, share. I was thinking before this started, how long I've known both of you. I mean, Jonathan, do you realize we're creeping up on 20 years that we've known each other? And how in the 20 years of our friendship, Jonathan, we've, there have probably been 50, there's an email chain like 50,000 messages long that's effectively just, the kind of discontinuous slinging of records and music and movies and books at one another. And, I do think that, that probably most writers are, we're all forged in that direction by being readers, right? And by being kind of insanely passionate about it. I do feel like I'm always happiest, pushing other people's work. That's a much more natural experience for me than hyping my own. And I think in many ways, there's an excitement that you get when you kind of discover that one's own writing is so relational, that you live in that your work really develops its value from other books, right? I mean, maybe when you're a younger person, or at least when I was a sort of much more narcissistic and vain kid, there was that dream of like, I'm going to write the book that blots out the sun, or whatever kind of idiotic thought that you have, the thing that the cheese that will stand alone. And then you realize not only that that's impossible, but that's not remotely desirable. Every book that I've ever loved, every writer that I've ever loved has sent me kind of trying to chase down their source codes. I'm sure you guys do this too. I remember reading Shirley Hazard's The Transit of Venus and being kind of blown away by that novel when I was in my 20s, and then meeting Shirley And it was like, all I wanted to do was find out where it came from, like what were the ancestral branches of that tree? Because I think that to me is a much more interesting form of artistic discovery and a personal discovery. It's like that's more interesting to me than sort of picking up the New York Times book review and doing what it tells me. I'm always interested in working in ways that are lateral, or just trying to find underground pools of water to drink.
It's so great, because reading your book, you get, at least I had this whole list of movies I wanted to see that you talked about. And you don't need to have, what's amazing about your writing is you're so good when you write about these things that it doesn't matter if I haven't seen the movie or read the book or heard the record. I mean, I want to seek those things out, but it's so compelling to see you go at it, the object.
Well, thanks. I mean, that's definitely a thing that I, worried about or thought about. I mean, I think a lot of the revision process of this book was sort of realizing like, oh, that's a tangent that I don't need. Or, I started to recognize places where I was starting to talk to myself or become over descriptive, or like the sort of boring person at the party who's telling you about something you haven't seen and don't care about.
No, it never felt like that. No.
Yeah.
I think because of the linkability and the YouTube ability of so much cultural material now, that the loving paraphrase is actually kind of it's a little bit of a, endangered species. When we were growing up, we would read a Manny Farber essay, and you might just basically have to visualize a movie that you never knew if you were going to get a chance to see.
Yeah.
Or how soon, or how you could do it.
Right.
And now there's this tendency to defer to the idea that everything's available.
Right.
Of course, some of these objects that you've got here genuinely aren't, or are really, really challenging to find, which is also exciting.
I know where to track down any of them. So if anybody who's paying attention gets a bee in their bonnet about it, I can usually point that person in the right direction.
This conversation should come with a Dropbox link. So one of the things I liked, and it just comes up in this, it's like in the undertow of this book, is you write about the fanishness of some of these characters, some of these artists and cultural explorers, their own sense of awe or fascination, or being on a kind of a weird, quest for things that will animate them. The way Warren Zevon feels about Ross MacDonald,
right?
Or the way Eleanor Perry has this, kind of crush on John Cheever, and then gets to work on the swimmer, and then gets to be disillusioned, or to make fun of what knowing the real John Cheever was like. This kind of cycle of infatuation and awe and sometimes disappointment that has to do with what happens when you throw yourself at cultural objects and identify with them over much.
Right. Or try to identify with the person behind them, as if the person is the same as the object.
Right.
And I think that's something that we've all, I don't think I've ever had a really disillusioning encounter with an artist that I liked, but it's also because I don't really ask much from them outside whatever's on the page. The rest of it is sort of value neutral for me. And that may be, and I sometimes wonder, maybe that's like the product of having a movie, industry upbringing, right? It's like if you grow up and you're a teenager and you meet like Marlon Brando or something, then it's like you just kind of realize like, oh, like artists aren't really intrinsically more interesting as people. I mean, Marlon was pretty interesting, but but it's it's hard to sort of like project too much onto the person behind the work of art. Even though I think in some cases in this book, of course, there's a little bit of that, right? It's hard to write about Tuesday Weld without writing about being a little bedazzled by Tuesday Weld, or maybe Carole Eastman was kind of the same for me. Like, what a crush I had on Carole Eastman, who's probably thanking her stars that she's dead and didn't have to have me chasing after her in person.
I really appreciated how many women writers that are underappreciated that you focus on in the book. It really is quite moving, and you are in love with them in this really beautiful artistic way. I wanted to read one little part that was really my favorite part of the book and ask you about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Success makes nobody kinder. There was never any recognition, any award, any paycheck, any honorific or yacht or private plane or compensation that made a person more deserving or better than he or she was before receiving it. Because empathy is a product of lack, of yearning and suffering and absence, and of the recognition that you don't, in fact, deserve any better than anyone else does, no matter what you've done or won or been awarded.
Right. Yeah, I remember that passage. I mean, I would, but yeah, that was a, I think, sometimes when you're writing and you hit certain patches and you go, oh, this is a sentiment that could practically be a creed. You feel like you're articulating something that you feel very strongly, and I definitely do feel that. I think that anything, and I don't think it's the world's most original sentiment to sort of say that like deprivation or loss is kind of what teaches you not to be the sort of a narcissistic 3-year-old. That is how you learn to navigate the world, and that is how you sort of learn that that's how we soften, right, as people, I think. And likewise, I think, having witnessed a lot of ego trips, for want of a better word. I mean, just being around people who had success, industry kind of success, or even just other kinds of success in the world, and seeing them kind of carry themselves in a way that can feel a little bit like, really, like you can relate to it. It's tempting. Like I think there's always a part of anybody that you think wouldn't it be great to just succumb to the illusion of your own great importance and value, but it's not. and that temptation is not really much of a temptation for me at all these days. But yeah.
So Matthew, I want to start. There's beginning to be some good action in the ask a question box, and some of these thoughts chime in with some things that I already was trying to find an angle on to ask you about. So I'm gonna feed in one of the first things that popped in, which is a really simple question, but I'm going to expand on it. I'm going to embroider it. The question is really simple. Didn't Fitzgerald live on that same street? Yeah. But it reminds me, listening to your reading, of how much I wanted to talk about the presence of architecture in this book, and the kind of haunting sensitivity to the strange, kind of shabby presence of certain kinds of Los Angeles apartment blocks and apartment buildings, and the way they become these these allegorical spaces. And it reminds me of Judith Freeman writing a whole book about Raymond Chandler by just writing about the different houses he lived in and apartments he lived in all over the Southlands. Yeah. And also makes me think of In a Lonely Place, and the way that Nicholas Ray uses that incredibly drab and incredibly evocative double apartment space that across which Bogart and Gloria Graham fall in love, and how Nicholas Ray was himself an architect. And it just seems to me that this book has it is a constant reiteration. It's one of the things that's actually the most hard-boiled about the style is your awareness of the presence of these kinds of rooms.
Yes, and that apartment complex in a Lonely Place is actually a few blocks away from the place that I was living on Hayworth, and it's a few blocks away from where I live now. And my wife and I, have been casing that place or walking by it regularly for the last couple of years. Yes. First of all, just to take the kind of kernel of the question first, that Fitzgerald, or more specifically Sheila Graham, who was Fitzgerald's last partner, lived in the building directly across from that apartment I rented, which really did have a nutty landlady who was very obsessed with Al Pacino and convinced that he was going to call her one day and propose. But those spaces, I mean, LA is such a strange, in many ways kind of confusing city architecturally, because there are just so many layers of it. There are those kind of mid-century, style buildings and Spanish style buildings. And, I think now if you walk around these same blocks, there are a lot of, kind of McMansion-y type houses. There's a weird way in which like LA maintains a kind of overlay of continuity, just like most cities do, but in its kind of particulate sense, buildings and places it's erasing itself all the time. And it's kind of like the great paradox of living here is the fact that on the one hand, it is actually kind of consistent, even though I think that consistency probably has to do more with kind of space and vegetation than it does with the buildings themselves. But it's, that's definitely a presence and I think a pressure in the book. I think this city is built, there's something very seductive about its default styles of architecture. All of them seem to promise something, that's very different from what you get in cities that are more densely put together. I mean, Dana, you have some incredible stuff about Syracuse architecture in Wayward, but it represents in a very different way. It represents in a sort of historic sense and in a sense of of architectural history. Whereas I think representing Los Angeles, it's not exactly in terms of its architectural history. It's more in terms of its architectural character, which is something very different.
Great.
Yeah.
Let's see. We have another good one here. Eden asks, Matthew, I just finished your book and loved it. I love how you engage with text, movies, biographies, but I also just love the writing style. Can you talk about how you approach sentence making? You do have the most gorgeous sentences.
That's lovely. Thank you, Eden. And coming from you, you do too. Yeah, I love that. And I think like all of us, when the sentence is the fundamental unit, right? I mean, that's the Don DeLillo assertion, right? The fundamental unit of a novel is not, it's not the paragraph, it's not the chapter, it's the sentence. And I think always, and again, I think this is probably like most writers, it's like, I'm kind of following my ear out into a space where I don't usually know how it's going to conclude or even necessarily where it's going. It's like, there's a kind of sound or rhythm or a kind of, phonetic balance that you're trying to attain, a kind of equilibrium, or you kind of come up against something and you're searching for a word and you're thinking, that word means what I need it to mean, but it's not the right word. And I think it's an area where I will never have too much wisdom to impart. Like, maybe I could if I were to get like Gary Lutz has that great essay, "The Sentence is a Lonely Place," which is mind blowing in its kind of attention to the acoustics of sentences. And also one of those things where I think, man, if I were to think my own kind of process through that hard, I would be so paralyzed I would never get anything written. I think that that's such a lovely thing to say, and obviously something that I paid a lot of attention to. I was definitely striving to get the sound and the feel of it, and then the weight of the sentences right. But it's also kind of an area where expertise stops, or where you have where you start to go, oh, you know the kinds of parallels and assonance and things that you're listening for, but that I don't feel like I bring that much that much conscious awareness to. I mean, do you guys, either of you?
I don't know. I think that it's something that I'm always trying to let the book determine.
Right.
Each book has its own kind of sentence making, and if I'm listening closely, it'll generate a kind of a internal system of its own, not one I could name or identify the algorithms, the rule of operation, but that I recognize.
Yeah.
It couldn't be exported out of a given book. Each
Right.
set of terms has a kind of a sentence making machine hidden inside it, and that's what I'm listening for. And then I just try to be very attentive to it.
It's never the same, and I think this book too. I think that this book I think I was aware of, in the same way that I knew that I wanted to keep moving between the personal narrative and the critical narrative. It's like those are different registers that I was conscious of moving in and out of. And then I thought, I never want to get sort of like trapped in my docent's voice, or in my kind of like, the more kind of like sentimental, romantic, descriptive voice. But it needed all those different, kind of all those different tones to stand up.
Great.
Yeah. That's a good question.
So should I jump in with another one, Dana?
Yeah, go for it.
There's another great one that's just also centers on something that would be criminal for us not to really talk about here, which is this book is, we're being very writerly and esoteric in our talking about it, about its the poetry and the beauty of it, but it's also a grab bag. It's a group of human beings presented, and it's a really funky bunch, right? You've got like the one rock star, Warren Zevon, who mostly people will kind of recognize his name, although they may just think Werewolves of London and be embarrassed. And you've got basically guaranteed unknowns, these hidden, lost, sort of semi-defeated women screenwriters, Eleanor Perry and Carole Eastman, and you've got F. Scott Fitzgerald, who it's almost like, oh my God, I can't believe you had the audacity to like do something with him. He's so he's like a postage stamp, and then you have people that are in kind of hide in the middle range, right? Like Thomas McGuane, he's still out there, making stuff, and yet there's this sense that the heyday was a while ago, or maybe the heyday was scheduled but didn't arrive, or he's just kind of really indeterminate, hard to get a fix on. And then you've got these famous filmmakers who are who flagrantly figures of catastrophe or collapse, right, in Michael Cimino and Hal Ashby. And so, but kind of like, what the hell? What are they all doing here together? And what we know, and the question asker is clever enough to ask for us here. How did you go about determining the list of artists to focus on? But also, was there a long list? How did you narrow it down? And please talk to us about some excluded figures who might have made it, who didn't.
There was a very long list. I mean, I could have gone on and on and on. And definitely, initially, I think I was leaning towards, there were some people that were sort of like absolute, Carole Eastman was like a no-brainer. Like that was kind of the first person I had in mind. And there was a lot of, I didn't want to choose a bunch of figures that were too, I could have chosen figures that were all like hyper obscure. And I felt like that would have been both, a little bit of a posture, a little bit of a, like music snob thing, or, think of these cool people you've never heard of, and also kind of frustrating and defeating. It's like one person that fascinates me, who I considered, for example, is the filmmaker Bill Gunn, who was only the second Black filmmaker ever to make a movie, to be hired to direct a movie at a major studio in 1970, and that movie exists in the Warner Brothers vault. It's like it got hit with an X rating, and it's really a wild movie. It's also impossible to see, and like the idea of kind of centering the people around people whose work is not available would be self-defeating. But the other thing I think was that, I had a much longer list, and I winnowed it down, kind of intuitively. It started to be sort of like, okay, these are the people that interest me. These are the people whose stories are interesting enough to tell. These are the people who are not over familiar. These are the people who are not, completely obscure. And then starting to realize, that these are people who represent different, who each had a sort of different archetypal outline. They felt a little bit like tarot cards or something. It wasn't each one had something different to say. Their story had something different to say, and then I think that there were some changes even as I wrote it. The section about Tuesday Weld was supposed to be about someone else, and I realized when I got there, I don't want to write about another screenwriter. There was a need to kind of vary the form, or someone asked me, like, why did you double up on Cimino and Ashby? And I thought that, and I said to them, part of that was the formal variation, was so that it stopped being like one chapter, one person.
Right.
But also because I think each of those were people that I felt like I might not have been as interested in. I mean, I love them both, particularly Hal Ashby, but I was more interested in kind of how they contrasted against one another than I was in either of their. There's an excellent Hal Ashby documentary that was that was made a couple of years ago, and I think and an excellent biography. So I thought, all by himself, like, that story's been told recently, but if you tell it in a different, telling it in a different kind of light, made sense.
And Matthew, a couple of these people are still alive.
Yes.
And how do they feel about being, have you sent the book to them?
Yeah, I have. Not to Tuesday Weld. I had a thought about getting to, about doing that. And then I thought, Tuesday Weld has been retired from public life for 20 years. There's nothing, even if I were to get to know her, there's nothing she would tell me that would be any more reliable than anything she'd already told other people, over the years. And it just felt like it would have been a violation. Renata Adler, who's someone that I have come to know fairly well. Renata knew I was working on it while I was working on it. And I think she was, kind of flattered and charmed and delighted. Tom McGuane, I did not know, and still don't pretend to know. But at the end of it, I emailed him and I was like, not to be all stalkerish or anything, but I wrote this book and I sent it to him, and he was incredibly gracious and lovely about it. It was, there were moments where I thought, will I enhance this project in any way by interviewing these people or trying to drag them into it? And in the end, the answer was always no. Unless I could kind of commune with their archive, which is what I did with Perry and Eastman, for example. I felt like it was much more about responding to the work, and responding to the narrative as it has filtered into the world, responding to the work and the mythology, much more than it was about responding to the person. Although Tom did fact check some things in his section.
When you're in the archives, did you think about, when you're looking at all these personal letters and things, did you think about how'd that make you feel about your own personal letters and things?
I would be honored if anyone ever gives a shit about them, obviously. And I think it's funny because it's like my own archive and correspondence is so full of, connection with other writers and other people who are, I've always sort of thought it's weird to consider, like whether I'll be kind of a footnote in a million other people's biographies or what.
We're going to be looking at those 50,000 emails at the ransom center,
Yeah. I think, I do think that going through someone's documents that way, Eleanor Perry's stuff felt a little more, there was some intimate stuff. There was like the deposition from her divorce hearing and stuff like that. Carole Eastman stuff, some of Carole Eastman's papers felt really private. I mean, there were letters. There are letters that I quote in the book that are clearly were meant only to be read by the recipient. And I think, I tried to sort of frame those things as carefully as I could, and as sort of gently, certainly in any interpretations of them. That's a thorny question, the sort of ethos of being a biographer, which I am not. And all I could really do was sort of treat them with as much loving care as I could. And I think the same is true of the people that I, the living people that I write about in the book, the people that are in my life or were in my life, who are, obviously their privacy is protected. They're all kind of in there in terms that are pseudonymous or under kind of fake initials or whatever. I mean, I think that's a universal writer's quandary, right? How does one deal with the kind of raw material out of which from which one is pulling? And about the only thing I can ever say is that I feel like, in any book, and certainly in this book, as long as I am much harder on myself than on the people that I'm, I don't ever write to settle scores, not ever. And even when there are kind of difficult feelings that attach to a person, that's certainly the case with writing about my mom in this book. I try to kind of drag my way far past them to arrive at something that's not just a grudge or a complaint.
Well, this raises a question that extends Dana's thought, which is your father's alive.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, he is. And long may he be. I mean, he's a feature of the book I'm writing now too. And both of my parents are. And fortunately, my dad has the healthy narcissism of someone who enjoys finding himself on the page. No, I mean, my dad is I think it's funny to sort of write as directly as this about my parents. I've done it elliptically before, and so it's interesting to do it quite as bluntly as in this book. But I feel fortunate in that with my mother's memory, I now have a much warmer relationship than I was able to have when she was kind of going through the shit that she went through when I was a teenager. And with my dad too, it's like I'm quite close, and he's difficult, but aren't all parents or almost all parents like difficult one way or another. It's a fraught relation. It's what makes it worth writing about in the first place.
Yeah, I think about this a lot because I lost one parent very early on, and that's generated a tremendous amount of response within my writing life. And then I've had the blessing that you've had. The other is eternal. He seems like he'll be around forever. So I don't even think about the what kind of relation I could have to the material of that relationship. If it were the reverse, it's just sort of like this space is the one I'm in, and it reminds me of there's this sort of pedestrian complaint about our a certain generation who maybe had kids later, that we ended up like with childcare and elder care at the same time,
right?
But for writers, this is such a defining structural reality, is the presence of one's living parents. And as people, with luck,
yeah,
can live so long. Writers can live with can become quite old and still be writing in the space of living parents.
Yeah.
It's really different. I'm musing aloud about this, but so we've actually done a pretty good job of. We welcome any further questions, but there's there's only one in the queue that we didn't get to, so I want to try and find some way to use it, even though it's kind of a goofy one for me to think about, because I don't know. It's sort of like trying to include me when I'm not sure I'm included. But it talks about how I didn't go to your high school, but then again there's this weird Bennington and Crossroads lineage for some people. And the question is, what explains this connection, spiritual or otherwise, or is it just random?
I actually can answer that question.
Well, but before you do, and I'm happy to have you do it, I want to do a thing where I extend it a little bit into a couple of other thoughts too, which is to think about, since the two of you both had, we grew up in LA with a reader's kind of sensibility, and it turned into the desire to write books. And the East-West stuff and the migration east, which is a part of both of your life stories.
Yeah,
I'd love to hear you think about that a little bit. And I also think that probably very, very few people who know your work pretty well, Matthew, may know that you went to Hampshire and sort of studied with James Baldwin.
Yeah,
which is an extraordinary thing that I would love to have people get a chance to hear you talk a little bit about.
Yeah, it is really an insane thing. I was going to say, just to kind of drag that question out of, give it a slightly less insular frame, because I think, Dana and I went to a school in Santa Monica that at the time was sort of a little experimental, private high school, not like a fancy prep school, which I think is kind of what it is now. It's like at that time it was my mom was the Spanish teacher there. That's why I went. And there were like 80 or 90 kids when I first got there in the whole school, grades 7 to 12. But it was very liberal arts oriented. It was kind of presided over by kind of peace loving hippies. And Dana and I both had a particularly influential film teacher, which is a man named Jim Hosny. And I know a lot of you in the audience know exactly who I'm talking about. But one of the things that obsesses me about Jim Hosny is how many books him or a slightly fictionalized version of him appears in. He appears in American Dream Machine. He appears in Stone Arabia, right, Dana?
Yeah, Stone Arabia and Innocence and Others, yeah.
Yeah, and Innocence and Others. He appears even in the novels of people who didn't go to Crossroads. He appears in one of Jarrett Kobeck's novels called The Future Won't Be Long. Hosny makes a fleeting appearance. But, I mentioned him because he was, we went to a kind of school where film was presented as part of the curriculum, which is probably not quite as irregular now. But in 1982 or 1983, that just seemed like wild that we were high school students being asked to read, Godard movies and Altman films in the same way that we were reading, Hawthorne or Chaucer for English or something. And I think that kind of encouraged us. And I think, Dana and I both went to Crossroads, and I went to Hampshire because it resembled Bennington in some ways. I mean, I applied to Bennington and was admitted. And, I knew that I needed to go to kind of a school that would be comparably kind of progressive and strange. And ultimately I thought, that Bennington would be a little too small. So I ported over to Hampshire, which was, Bennington-like, but bigger. And both of those places, I mean, the Hampshire College and the 5 colleges that surrounded it had Baldwin. Joseph Brodsky was teaching there, who had, at the time that he had just won the Nobel Prize. Anita Desai, the English novelist. James Tate was doing the poetry program at UMass. Like there was this was like a literary place, and Bennington was Bennington had Malamud, right? Who else did Bennington?
Well,
have?
Just barely when I got there.
Yeah, sure.
He was finishing along.
Yeah,
he was sort of emeritus, but yeah, I met him a couple of times.
Right, but it produced writers, right? It produced you, it produced Brett, it produced Donna Tartt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think I don't know. I think going to a school that was arts oriented, going to a high school that was arts oriented, sort of, the idea of going to a more orthodox, to having a more kind of like classical college experience, didn't quite seem like it was going to make sense. Dana, I forgot what your road out was from Crossroads.
What?
I don't remember where you went after Crossroads, but
I went to Columbia with Adam and Wade and for a while. For a while. And then I left. Okay. So there are some more questions in the chat.
Great.
Mark Norris, speaking of Crossroads,
and
the connector of all, Mark Norris, wants to know, speaking of teenagers, was Fast Times at Ridgemont High an accurate depiction of that era?
I love that question.
I love that movie.
Yeah, I love that movie too. And wouldn't we sort of have to say yes and no? Like, did you? I read Fast Times at Ridgemont High before the movie was produced. The manuscript, I think it was a book before it was a novel, and so Cameron Crowe's like manuscript for Fast Times at Ridgemont High was.
I thought it was like a Rolling Stone article first.
Yeah. I think whatever it was, I read it as a prose text at first.
It was a big piece in Rolling Stone. Yeah,
and it struck me as sort of semi-plausible. I think when you're that age, you kind of look at movies about teenagers, and a lot of the time you just think, well, this is just not right at all. It doesn't feel that way. The movie I remember seeing when I was a teenager that did sort of capture the vibe of being an LA high school student was Foxes, Adrian Lyne's Foxes. Do you guys remember that?
Yeah, I do remember that.
That I think had the kind of like feral quality that I remember that era having, of just these kids with like no parental supervision, and no, and sort of lots of drugs. Like it just, that felt, I was like, oh, that's real. I'd say like the Fast Times seemed like the PG, like the PG version of what it was like.
And there's one more.
Yeah.
Where I can't find it now. Oh, Matthew, have you ever crossed paths with another introspective LA writer with art world ties, albeit low profile in recent years, Eve Babbitt's? And in fact, you've written the introduction to some of those Babbitt's books, right?
I wrote the introduction to Slow Days, Fast Company, to the reissue of that. And the answer is yes, but only obliquely. Eve was sort of in reclusion when I never met her before that, but I had been a fan of her work, and I had been among many people pestering Edwin Frank at NYRB to reprint that novel. And when they finally did, they asked me to write the introduction. And I know Eve's sister Morandi a bit, who's just as interesting and lovely as Eve. But I think Eve has been, and my friend Lily Annalik knows Eve firsthand. But I think Eve has been in somewhat iffy health over the last couple of years. I think that's now kind of more publicly understood to be the case. And so she really hasn't been. She hasn't been accessible, and I think she would have been if I had made a thing about it, but I've never really felt like I needed to meet Eve Babbitt's. The Eve Babbitt's that I was interested in and will always be interested in is the Eve Babbitt's who lives in the book itself, in the books themselves.
Great.
Yeah.
We're kind of closing in on this, and I'm just, it's been such a warm talk, and also the questions have been so great, and the comments in the side, and just looking at the names of people who are in it, I feel in a ideal room here. So, just really happy for you, Matthew. Congratulations again. And this is the kind of celebration you deserve. I wish we were all able to just raise a glass in person right now.
Yeah, I wish that too, especially seeing the glancing at the people who are here. It's like, these are people I would wish to see in real life. But here we are.
Why don't we ask you the traditional last question, which can be kind of double, is what else are you doing? If people want to hear you talk more, are you doing more stuff like this, or how else are you celebrating this book? And what are you working on next?
Yes.
What's writing wise? I
am doing a sort of brief sequence of these events, and then some others in August. I'm going to be at City Lights, via all of these are virtual for now. I'll be at City Lights with my old friend Adam Fowler of Jawbreaker, who is one of my favorite people on this earth, and I really and I've known him for so long. That's going to be a very different conversation from this one. And then Thursday night, I'll be with Janet Fitch via McNally Jackson in New York. And that'll be a third thing. I don't expect to be. I won't be reading the same pieces. We won't be talking about the same things.
Cool.
And then there'll be some other events in August. Eventually, hopefully, something actually in person somewhere in Los Angeles would be nice. As for what I'm working on now, I have a book that I'm working on for Echo Press, and it's also kind of a hybrid, and we'll see where it goes. I mean, I'm sort of in the middle of it because it is also in a slightly more traditional sense a memoir, but also in a completely less traditional sense, also a cultural history. It's about how the movies, how the studio system lived and died over the last 75 years, and it's a strange. It's very novel-like, and there's definitely moments in it where I think, can I do this? Can I just sort of like be Ronald Reagan in a scene for, in 1952, and then be my dad, and then be my mom, alone in her apartment in 1962. And, it's all kind of wound up with the wars between the agencies and the studios. And it's a completely different kind of book than this one. And it's, it makes me realize, even though it is also not a novel, how attached I am to the novel, how much I love a certain kind of, widescreen, long form storytelling, about people who are not myself.
That's great.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
Great to hear. Yeah. Can't wait.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'm just going to congratulate us all for being so wonderful, and thank you again, Matthew, and of course Book Soup for hosting this and doing what we need so badly, which is to keep book selling in person.
Yeah,
as a real thing.
Yeah,
it matters a lot.
More than anything, it does.
Yeah.
Didn't want to cut anyone off if you had more final words. This was such a great conversation. Thank you all for being with us at Book Soup. Thank you for being such a lively audience. You're all amazing. And thank you for joining us and supporting local bookstores, whether it's through audiobooks with Libro FM or buying directly from us in person or online. We're always online. So if you're far away but want to support Book Soup, you can do that way. Congratulations again, Matthew, and Dana, congratulations soon. And Jonathan, I know you had a book last year, so congratulations. Everyone, thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you, guys.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Bye.